Can CachyOS really replace Windows in 2026? That is the question a lot of people are asking for one simple reason. Windows has become harder to trust for many everyday users, while Linux distributions like CachyOS are starting to look more polished, faster, and more practical than they used to be. CachyOS is not a small hobby project anymore. It is a performance-optimized Arch-based distribution that officially recompiles packages for newer CPU instruction sets, ships optimized kernels, and has continued to add features throughout 2026 to make the experience more usable on modern desktops and handhelds. So I tested it for 30 days, with one question in mind. Could this actually become my main system if I wanted to leave Windows behind? Not as a fantasy, not as a weekend experiment, but as a real daily driver for browsing, work, gaming, media, installs, updates, and the messy little tasks that usually expose whether an operating system is ready for normal people. The answer is more complicated than the usual Linux fan or Windows loyalist will tell you. CachyOS is genuinely impressive. It is also not magic, and whether it can replace Windows depends less on marketing and more on what you actually need from a computer every day. To understand why, you first need to understand what CachyOS says it is. CachyOS presents itself as a blazingly fast Arch Linux distribution built for modern hardware. Officially, its biggest selling point is not just that it is Linux, but that it is Linux tuned for performance. Project's optimized repositories are compiled specifically for x86-64-3, to x86-64-4, and Zen 4 or Zen 5 architectures, with the documentation claiming between 5 and 20% performance uplift in supported workloads. That is a serious claim, and unlike a lot of vague, faster-than-ever style marketing, it is based on a real technical approach, using more advanced instruction sets and distributing packages that are built for newer processors, rather than aiming for the broadest possible compatibility. The kernel side is equally important. CachyOS maintains Linux-CachyOS variants with different schedulers, including Bohr, which the project describes as being suited for interactive workloads and gaming. In plain language, that means the system tries to stay responsive under load, especially when you are gaming or multitasking. For a lot of users, that matters more than a theoretical benchmark win. A computer that feels smooth is often more useful than a computer that scores slightly higher in a synthetic test. That is the official promise. But the real question is whether the promise holds up when you stop reading the documentation and start using the system every day. Over the 30-day test period, the first thing that stood out was how much of CachyOS is designed around reducing friction for people who want performance without doing everything manually. The March 2026 release added several visible quality-of-life improvements, including animated desktop previews in the installer and Winboat integration for Windows apps inside the CachyOS Welcome app. That matters because one of the biggest reasons people avoid Linux is not ideology. It is fear of inconvenience. They want a system that can still run the occasional Windows-only tool, play games reasonably well, and not demand a terminal for every small task. CachyOS is trying to close that gap. In my testing, the desktop experience was one of the strongest parts of the distro. It felt quick from boot, fast when launching applications, and responsive during ordinary work like browsing, downloading, video playback, and switching between apps. That lines up with what a number of recent reviewers have observed as well. Multiple current reviews describe CachyOS as feeling especially fast and polished on newer hardware, while also noting that the gains are not always dramatic in gaming, compared with other modern Linux setups. And that is where the story becomes more interesting, because the biggest myth around CachyOS is that it is only for gamers. That is not really true. Gaming is a major reason people try it. But the deeper appeal is that it makes Linux feel less like a compromise and more like a tailored system. For a technically comfortable user, that is a huge advantage. There is also the privacy angle, which is part of why many Windows users are even looking at alternatives in the first place. CachyOS does not come with the same built-in commercial surveillance model that people increasingly associate with Windows. The project's browser settings repository shows telemetry disabled in the Cachy browser configuration, and the distro's recent updates include bug reporting scripts that automatically redact sensitive data, such as IP addresses, host names, usernames, and MAC addresses before submission. That does not make it anonymous. No operating system is. But it does mean the default posture is less invasive than what many users feel they are getting from mainstream consumer platforms. Still, none of that answers the biggest question. Can it actually replace Windows? For some people, yes. For others, not yet. If your main use case is web browsing, office work, media, coding, schoolwork, and gaming on supported titles, CachyOS can absolutely be a realistic Windows replacement in 2026, if your workflow depends on a very specific Windows-only driver, niche enterprise software, Adobe-heavy creative pipelines, or hardware utilities that only exist on Windows, then the answer becomes much more conditional. That is not a weakness unique to CachyOS. That is the reality of moving to Linux in general. The more honest conclusion after 30 days is this: CachyOS can replace Windows for a large group of people, but not for everyone, and not without a little willingness to learn. That said, there were a few surprises in the testing that are worth taking seriously. One of them is how much people online debate actual performance gains. CachyOS's own documentation claims package-level improvements for supported CPU targets, and some reviewers report measurable gains in benchmarks or compilation-heavy tasks. But gaming results are often much narrower than the marketing suggests. In real-world terms, you may see a smoother-feeling desktop and perhaps stronger performance in some workloads, but you should not expect every game to suddenly run dramatically faster just because you switch distros. That distinction matters because it stops the conversation from drifting into hype. Another surprise is how much the user experience has improved in the 2026 releases. CachyOS recently added better installer previews, better handheld support, automatic firmware update handling on devices like the Steam Deck and Legion Go in its handheld edition, and broader convenience features that make the distro feel more intentional than a raw Arch install. That is important because it suggests the project is actively trying to make advanced Linux more approachable. It does not want to be merely a performance toy for power users, it wants to be a real desktop system. But there is still a line between approachable and plug and play, and Windows still owns the plug and play category for most users. That is the central tension. For example, if you are the kind of person who wants to install an operating system once and never think about maintenance, Windows still wins on familiarity and vendor support. If you're the kind of person who wants more control, fewer background annoyances, and a system that feels lighter and more responsive, CachyOS can be very compelling. That is why many recent reviewers describe it as surprisingly usable, but still not something they would casually recommend to someone who is not already somewhat computer literate. My own experience lines up with that. The system was stable enough for daily use, but it also rewarded people who were comfortable making choices, choosing the right kernel, understanding how Proton works, knowing when to use a native package, a flat pack, or a compatibility layer. None of that is impossible, but it is different from the Windows mindset, where users often expect the operating system to abstract away most of the complexity. And that difference matters more than people admit. Because when people ask whether CachyOS can replace Windows, they are usually asking two separate questions at once. One is technical. Can it run my apps, games, and hardware? The other is psychological. Am I willing to live in a system that asks a little more from me? For many people, the first answer is increasingly yes, and the second answer is still maybe. That is why the most accurate verdict is not yes or no. It is yes if you are the right kind of user. Here's the practical breakdown. If you want speed, customization, strong modern hardware support, a cleaner default feel, and a distro that's actively evolving in 2026, CachyOS is one of the best Linux options to test right now. If you want maximum software compatibility, the fewest surprises, and the broadest vendor support without learning new tools, Windows is still the safer choice. If you are somewhere in the middle, CachyOS is good enough that it deserves a real trial, not just a passing glance. And if you are thinking about switching, the best approach is not to wipe your current system immediately. Test it on a secondary drive, spare machine, or dual boot setup first. Spend time with the installer, the update process, your browser, your games, your files, and the exact software you rely on every week. That is the only way to know if a distro like this is a serious replacement or just an exciting experiment. After 30 days, my honest conclusion is simple. CachyOS is no longer just another Linux distro. It is one of the clearest signs that the Linux desktop usability is catching up to the expectations ordinary users have been trained to expect from Windows. It does not beat Windows at everything, but for the right person, it is now close enough to be a real alternative. Another thing that stood out over those 30 days is how the wider ecosystem around Linux is changing. More game developers are shipping native Linux versions or Proton-ready builds. More hardware manufacturers are offering better documentation for Linux drivers, or at least avoiding Windows-only utilities that completely lock out other operating systems. And more cloud services are offering web-based tools that work equally well on any desktop. All of that makes the "what will I lose if I leave Windows" calculation look better than it did just a few years ago. CachyOS is not pushing this shift by itself, but it is riding it intelligently. It is one of the distros that is trying to make the jump to Linux feel less like a retreat and more like an upgrade. That does not mean it is perfect. There are still driver quirks, some proprietary tools that only work on Windows, and occasional edge case bugs that require manual workarounds. But if your work does not revolve around those specific Windows-only dependencies, the trade-off begins to look very reasonable. If you are the kind of person who enjoys understanding how your operating system works, who is willing to read a few lines of documentation when something goes wrong, and who wants to stop feeling like they are being sold features wrapped in telemetry and tracking, then CachyOS is a strong candidate for your main desktop. If you are the kind of person who only wants to press power on and have everything just work, with the broadest possible software compatibility, then Windows is still the more predictable choice. And that is ultimately the real decision point. It is not just about whether CachyOS is fast enough or stable enough. It is about whether you are ready to trade a certain kind of convenience for a different kind of freedom. If you want a fast, privacy-conscious move after watching this, install CachyOS on a second drive or a USB test machine. If you want to help someone else make a smarter decision, share this video with a friend who is tired of Windows. Comment which one you chose. The next investigation will go deeper into another tech platform that looks convenient on the surface, but gets much more complicated once you inspect the defaults. CachyOS can replace Windows for many users in 2026. The real question is whether you are ready for a system that gives you more control and expects a little more from you in return.